Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever found yourself in a moment of deep frustration, feeling like the weight of the world is on your shoulders, and then almost instinctively you pick up the phone, start typing a message, or sit down to talk with someone about it? That first breath of relief as you share your pain, your frustration, your challenge, it can feel like the storm in your heart has begun to settle. But here's the thing. Sharing your problems, though it might feel freeing in the moment, is not always the most empowering thing you can do for yourself. Now, I know that sounds counterintuitive. We're taught to talk about our feelings, to share with others, to lean on our loved ones when things get tough, and in many cases that's true. But there's a subtle difference between vulnerability that leads to growth and vulnerability that, instead of releasing us, keeps us tethered to our struggles. So let's pause for a moment and ask ourselves, why are we sharing and with whom? First, let's talk about the power of ownership. When we face difficulty, there's often a natural impulse to lay it down at someone else's feet. But real power comes when we stand in our own truth, when we take ownership of our own journey. It doesn't mean we have to carry it alone, but it does mean that we are the ones who are driving the bus. The moment you claim your experience, you begin to transform it. You aren't just a victim of circumstance, you become the author of your story. Second, though, we must acknowledge the risk of oversharing. Think about it: when we open up too quickly, too widely, we can dilute our pain. By telling everyone around us, we sometimes make our struggles smaller in their eyes, or worse, we amplify the drama unnecessarily. When we share too much too soon, we risk turning our problems into entertainment, and that's not what our souls need. You see, oversharing with people who aren't equipped to hold your pain can be harmful not just to them, but to you. Imagine for a moment putting your most intimate struggles into the hands of someone who doesn't have the capacity to understand them, or worse, someone who doesn't take them seriously. It's like entrusting a fragile treasure to someone who doesn't know its value. You deserve more than that. Your vulnerability is precious, treated as such. Which leads me to my third point: we must consider the emotional energy of others. When we share, especially with people who are not emotionally prepared, we might be unintentionally burdening them. Our friends and loved ones, as much as they want to help, are not always in the right place to carry the weight we place on them. This doesn't mean they don't care. It means that they may not have the emotional space to hold our pain in a way that nurtures us. So before you share, ask yourself, will this person be able to hold my experience with empathy and understanding, or will it add an emotional burden to both of us? Next, let's talk about creating safe spaces. Not everyone deserves to hear your struggles, but the right people, the ones who have earned the privilege of your trust, can become anchors in the storm. A true safe space is one that offers not just listening, but understanding, compassion, and a willingness to walk beside you without judgment. Not every conversation has to be an emotional dumping ground. Sometimes what we need is a place to process, to grow, to move forward. This brings us to the final, most empowering point: transforming our own narrative. The most powerful thing we can do in the face of adversity is not to simply share our problems, but to change the way we tell the story. Instead of leading with our pain, let's speak to our strength. Instead of defining ourselves by our struggles, let's define ourselves by our resilience. Speak your truth not as a cry for sympathy, but as a declaration of your journey, your process, and your growth. I know that pain and difficulty will always be part of the human experience. Life isn't perfect, it's messy, it's hard, and it will challenge you, but you don't have to be defined by what's hard. You don't have to tell everyone your problems. What you do need is the strength to process, to reflect, and to stand tall, knowing that your story is yours to shape. Friends, your struggles don't have to be a public spectacle. The greatest gift you can give yourself is the gift of quiet resilience, of finding your voice, your power, and your path forward without needing to constantly explain it to the world. So the next time you feel that urge to share your pain, take a moment and ask yourself, why am I sharing this? Who am I sharing it with? And most importantly, how can I show up for myself in a way that empowers my growth rather than leaves me feeling exposed and dependent on others? The answers lie not in endless sharing, but in owning your story and shaping it into something powerful. I want you to think for a moment about a time when you've been struggling. Maybe it was a moment of doubt, a heavy burden you carried, or a period of pain you weren't sure how to get through. Maybe it was a relationship that was falling apart, a career that was stuck, or a personal challenge that seemed bigger than you. In those moments, didn't it feel like the weight of the world was on your shoulders and all you wanted to do was share it with someone? The urge to speak it out, to let it escape from your mind and into someone else's ears, is almost irresistible. There's something in that release, isn't there? That first breath you take when you tell someone, here's what I'm going through. This is my struggle. This is my struggle. This is my hurt. It can feel like an immediate release, as though a little bit of the weight has been lifted from your heart. But here's the question, does it really? We live in a world that tells us to be vulnerable. We celebrate vulnerability, we admire it, and in many ways, we seek it as a way to feel understood and seen. And yet, there's something important we often miss. Vulnerability, in its truest form, is not just about sharing our pain, but about who we share it with and why we share. Because while there is immense power in sharing our struggles, there is also a responsibility to understand what that sharing brings us. Does it lead to healing, or does it merely invite more weight into our lives? I know it's easy to think that the more we talk about our problems, the more others will understand us. But here's the thing that no one tells you in those vulnerable moments. Sharing your struggles is not the same as processing them. Talking about our challenges can feel like a momentary relief, like opening a valve to let some of the pressure out. But if we aren't careful, it can also leave us feeling exposed, like we've handed our pain to someone else and now they're holding it. In some cases, they may not even know what to do with it. In some cases, they might just add more confusion, more judgment, or more distance between us and the healing we're seeking. I think we've all been there, reaching out to a friend or family member, thinking this is the person who will listen, who will understand, and in some cases, we're met with empathy and support, which is exactly what we need. But in others, we find that our struggles don't land the way we'd hoped. Instead of feeling lighter, we might leave the conversation feeling more misunderstood, or worse, more alone in our pain. But here's the other side of it. There is a kind of vulnerability that does empower us, a kind that doesn't seek validation or sympathy, but rather clarity and strength. When we share our struggles, it's not just about finding someone to listen. It's about asking ourselves, what do I need from this? Am I sharing to process my pain and move forward, or am I seeking something else, perhaps the reassurance that I'm not alone in my struggle? You see, we don't have to share everything with everyone. Vulnerability, when practiced with intention, can become a source of incredible power. It becomes the courage to acknowledge our pain without needing to cast it on to others to carry. The deepest form of healing comes not from the release of our struggles into the world, but from the ability to sit with them, reflect on them, and decide how we move forward from them. So the next time you feel that impulse to share your heartache, take a pause. Ask yourself, what do I really need right now? Do I need someone to carry this for me? Or am I ready to stand in my own story, to own my challenges and begin the work of transforming them into something powerful? This is the deeper power of vulnerability, the power to be both seen and strong at the same time. It's the recognition that our struggles don't have to define us and that sharing them is only part of the journey. The real work, the true strength, lies in how we rise above them. When we face hardship, there's often a natural impulse to reach outward, to look for someone to help carry the load, to take the weight off our shoulders, to make sense of it all for us. We think that if we can just explain the situation to someone else, it will somehow make it easier to bear. And sometimes in the right moments, that kind of sharing can offer comfort, even relief. But what I've come to realize and what I want to share with you tonight is that the real power doesn't lie in what we ask others to do for us. The real power lies in the ownership we take of our own stories. Ownership isn't about doing everything alone or carrying all the burden without help. It's about recognizing that at the end of the day, We are the ones who shape the narrative. We are the ones who choose how we respond. We are the ones who decide what our struggles mean and how we move through them. It's not about pretending the hard things don't exist, but about claiming them not as something that happened to us, but as something we get to move through, learn from, and ultimately rise above. I've seen so many people, myself included, get stuck in the cycle of blaming circumstances, people, or events for their pain. And don't get me wrong, there are definitely things outside of our control. Life is not fair. People can hurt us, circumstances can derail us, and the world doesn't always make sense. But I've learned that the moment we let those things define us, we give away our power. We start to see ourselves as victims of our circumstances, and that's a dangerous place to be. When we don't take ownership of our experience, we let the narrative play out on someone else's terms. But here's the thing, when we take ownership, we regain control. It doesn't mean we have all the answers. It doesn't mean we have to be perfect. It doesn't even mean that everything is going to turn out the way we hope. What it means is that in the face of whatever difficulty we're enduring, we get to decide who we are in the process. We get to decide how we move through it. We get to decide what we're learning from it and how we want to show up in the world because of it. Taking ownership doesn't mean we ignore our feelings or dismiss our pain. It means we stop letting those things dictate our story. We stop believing that our struggles define us, and instead we focus on how we want to transform them. In the middle of the storm, when everything feels like it's falling apart, ownership is what gives us a sense of agency. It gives us the courage to ask ourselves, what do I need right now? And how can I move forward with grace, even when I don't have all the answers? Think about a time in your life when you truly took ownership of a situation. Maybe it was a tough decision you had to make, or a difficult conversation you had to have, or a challenge you faced head on, even when you didn't know how it would turn out. What happened when you stepped into that moment with ownership? What happened when you stopped waiting for someone else to fix it or tell you what to do? More often than not, you came out stronger on the other side. You learned something about yourself. You discovered a resilience you didn't know you had. Ownership doesn't just make us stronger, it teaches us what we're made of. It shows us that even in the darkest moments, we are capable of finding the light. Now, that's not to say that it's easy. Taking ownership means confronting our fears, facing the hard truths about ourselves, and sometimes accepting responsibility for things we'd rather avoid. But there's incredible freedom in this. The moment we decide that we are the authors of our own lives, we take back our power. And when we step into that power, we open up new possibilities. We stop waiting for things to change and start changing ourselves. We stop seeing ourselves as passive recipients of life's punches and start seeing ourselves as active participants in our own transformation. The power of ownership lies in the realization that we get to choose what happens next. We get to decide what our struggles mean. They don't have to define us, but they can shape us into who we're becoming. They can teach us lessons that we may not fully understand now, but that will guide us on our journey. And every step of the way, we can take pride in the fact that no matter how hard things get, we never lost sight of the fact that we are the ones holding the pen to our story. So the next time you're facing a challenge, whether it's a personal struggle, a professional setback, or just a moment of self-doubt, remember this: you don't have to wait for permission to take ownership. You don't have to wait for someone to tell you that it's okay to stand in your truth. You can take it now. In this moment, you can choose to step into your power, to claim your voice, and to begin rewriting the narrative. And trust me, when you do, everything changes. There's something incredibly human about the urge to share our struggles, isn't there? When life gets hard, when the weight feels unbearable, we instinctively reach out. We want someone to hear us, to understand what we're going through. It can feel like a relief to speak our pain out loud, to see someone's eyes widen in recognition of our struggle. In that moment, sharing our burdens can make us feel lighter, less alone. But there's a delicate line between sharing to heal and oversharing in a way that actually leaves us feeling more exposed, more vulnerable, and sometimes even more lost. I want you to think for a moment about a time when you shared your pain with someone, a friend, a colleague, a family member, and instead of feeling heard or understood, you walked away feeling something else. Maybe you felt judged, maybe you felt dismissed, or maybe you simply felt like the person you confided in didn't know how to hold your struggle. The connection you hoped to find in that exchange wasn't there. You gave a piece of yourself, and in return, you didn't get what you needed. It's not that the person didn't care. It's just that sometimes people don't have the capacity, the tools, or even the emotional maturity to meet us where we're at. This is where the risk of oversharing comes into play. We often think that the more we speak our pain, the more relief we'll feel, but sometimes the opposite happens. We overextend our vulnerability, putting our most intimate struggles into the hands of people who, despite their good intentions, can't hold that space for us in a way that is helpful or healing. When we overshare, we can unintentionally burden others, making them feel uncomfortable, unsure of how to respond, or even pressured to fix things in ways they may not be equipped to do. And when we put our pain in the hands of someone who can't process it with us, we can leave that exchange feeling drained, exposed, and sometimes even more isolated than before. But there's more to it than just the people we share with. There's the way we can lose ourselves in the process of oversharing. When we talk too much, when we spill every detail, we can sometimes begin to see ourselves only through the lens of our pain. We risk getting stuck in a narrative where every conversation revolves around what's wrong, what's broken, what's missing, instead of shifting the focus to how we're growing, how we're learning, how we're becoming. In that way, oversharing can trap us in a cycle of emotional overwhelm, leaving us unable to see the bigger picture of our own resilience. It's also important to recognize that the people we share with aren't always the right audience for our most raw moments. Not everyone is equipped to hold space for deep, complicated emotions, and that's okay. It doesn't mean they're bad people, it just means they're not the right person to help us navigate this particular moment. There's a big difference between casual conversation and the kind of vulnerable sharing that requires someone to be emotionally present, to listen without judgment, to offer compassion rather than solutions. And when we overshare with someone who doesn't have the capacity to meet us in that space, we risk leaving them feeling overwhelmed as well. It's important to recognize that not everyone has the emotional bandwidth to hold the intensity of our emotions. Think of it like this: when you open up to someone, it's as if you're handing them a piece of your emotional landscape. And just as you wouldn't hand a fragile, precious object to someone who might drop it, you have to be mindful of who you're entrusting your feelings to. Not everyone is equipped to hold the space for that vulnerability in a way that honors and nurtures you. Some people might take it on unknowingly, and it might leave them feeling drained or even burdened, while you might walk away from the conversation still feeling unsettled, like the weight has only shifted, not lifted. The thing is, this exchange of energy isn't always obvious. It can be subtle, almost invisible. And because it's not something we often think about, we can find ourselves inadvertently expecting others to carry more of our emotional load than they are capable of. Think about a time when you've been on the receiving end of someone else's emotional energy. Maybe a friend, a colleague, or a family member came to you with a heavy heart. They shared their struggles with you in a way that left you feeling everything they were going through, sometimes even more than you were able to process. It's easy to feel compelled to respond, to give advice, or to try to fix things. But what we don't always see in that moment is how much energy we've absorbed. And this is where things can become tricky. Because just as we can absorb the energy of others, we also can unintentionally absorb their pain, their anxiety, their unresolved emotions. This isn't to say that we shouldn't share our struggles with others, or that we shouldn't be there for the people we care about. Of course we should. Human connection is what makes us resilient. But what we need to recognize is that this emotional exchange is a two-way street. And it's not just about being mindful of how we share our struggles, it's about being mindful of who we share with and how much we share. We have to ask ourselves, am I sharing in a way that honors both my need for connection and the capacity of the person I'm sharing with? And we also have to consider, what am I taking on from this exchange, and is it something I'm prepared to carry? This is why creating safe spaces for vulnerable conversations is so important. A safe space isn't just a place where we feel comfortable sharing, it's a space where both parties understand the energy they're bringing into the conversation. In a truly safe space, there's an unspoken agreement we're both here to hold each other, to listen without judgment, and to carry the emotional weight without letting it drag us both down. In these spaces, emotional energy doesn't just transfer, it is nurtured. We take care of each other's emotional well-being without one person being left depleted and the other feeling unheard. But in spaces where we're not sure if someone can hold that weight, we have to be more intentional. We have to take responsibility for our energy and recognize that it's okay to not share everything with everyone. Sometimes it's about knowing that certain emotions need time to settle before we share them. Sometimes it's about understanding that our loved ones might be carrying their own emotional load and may not have the capacity to absorb ours. And in those moments, we can begin to learn the art of self-regulation, of sitting with our emotions long enough to process them before we release them, of recognizing that we can give ourselves the time and space to heal without placing that emotional burden on others. When we learn to hold our own energy, we don't just protect the emotional well-being of those around us, we also preserve our own. We stop draining ourselves through constant outpourings of vulnerability, and we begin to reclaim our strength. Emotional energy is precious both for ourselves and for the people we share it with. When we are intentional about where we direct the energy and who we share it with, we create deeper, more meaningful connections. And ultimately, we allow ourselves the space to heal in ways that are not dependent on others, but rooted in the strength of our own emotional resilience. There's something profoundly healing about being in a space where you feel completely safe to be yourself, safe to speak your truth, and safe to exist without the fear of judgment or rejection. Safe spaces aren't just places, they're the intangible conditions we create through trust, empathy, and respect. They are environments where vulnerability is met with understanding and where the complexity of our emotions isn't only accepted but embraced. But here's the thing, creating a safe space doesn't happen by accident. It requires intention, effort, and deep emotional awareness. And it's more important now than ever. We all know the weight of living in a world that often feels chaotic, overwhelming, and divisive. There are moments when the outside world feels like a constant barrage of noise, judgment, and expectation. In those moments, we yearn for a place of refuge, a space where we can put down the armor we wear for the world and just breathe. That is the power of a safe space. It's a place where we don't have to be anything other than who we are in that moment. We don't have to edit our feelings, sanitize our truths, or apologize for our existence. We can be raw, we can be messy, and we can be broken. And in doing so, we experience something extraordinary, the freedom to heal. The thing is, too many of us walk through life without ever feeling truly safe to express ourselves. We're afraid to show up with our full selves because we worry about being rejected, misunderstood, or even judged. The fear of vulnerability, of being seen at our most imperfect, keeps us locked in a cage of silence. And the longer we stay in that cage, the more we convince ourselves that we are alone in our struggles. We internalize the belief that we are the only ones who feel this way, or that our pain is too much for others to carry. But here's the truth, the only way we begin to break that silence is by finding spaces where we can speak our truth, no matter how raw or unpolished it might be. When we talk about creating safe spaces, we're not just talking about physical environments, we're talking about emotional landscapes, places where we can show up without fear of being judged or rejected for who we truly are. And in order to create these spaces, we have to be conscious of the way we show up for others. We have to listen with empathy, without rushing to fix or offer solutions. We have to hold space for the full spectrum of human emotion, the joy, the grief, the fear, and the anger, and let those emotions unfold at their own pace. But it's not just about what we offer others, it's also about the way we show up for ourselves. We must create safe spaces within our own hearts where we can be gentle with ourselves, where we can sit with our emotions without trying to run from them or push them down. The safest spaces we can inhabit are the ones where we honor our own vulnerability, where we allow ourselves the freedom to feel whatever comes up without fear of being overwhelmed by it. This is the foundation for all safe spaces, both external and internal. And here's something I've learned: safe spaces are not always easy to find. In a world that often prioritizes productivity, image, and perfection, vulnerability is seen as a weakness. The constant pressure to perform, to be on, to have it all together can make us feel like we have to hide our true selves. We create walls to protect ourselves from rejection, and as a result, we distance ourselves from the very connections we crave. But when we find or create safe spaces, whether they're with close friends, family, mentors, or even within ourselves, we open up the possibility of true connection. The kind of connection that doesn't require us to be perfect or to pretend or to put on a mask. It's the kind of connection that allows us to be deeply human with one another. The real magic of a safe space is that it invites us to bring our full selves into the room without fear of being diminished by our weaknesses, our pain, or our imperfections. It allows us to speak from our hearts, to say what we might have kept hidden, and to be seen for who we really are without the layers of shame or self-doubt that so often cloud our interactions. In that moment of being truly seen and heard, something powerful happens. We feel less alone. We realize that our struggles, our pain, and our humanity are shared by others, and that we don't have to carry them in isolation. But here's the catch: creating safe spaces isn't something that can happen in isolation. It's not just up to one person to create safety for others. It's a collective effort. It's a shared responsibility. It takes us being intentional, aware, and vulnerable with one another. It means showing up not just for the easy conversations, but for the hard ones too. It means creating a culture where listening is just as important as speaking, where empathy is valued over judgment, where we don't just tolerate each other's differences, we celebrate them. Creating safe spaces also means embracing the discomfort that comes with vulnerability. It means sitting with the awkwardness, the uncertainty, and the messiness that often arises when people begin to share their deepest truths. It means being okay with the silence, the tears, the moments when we don't have the answers but just need to be present with each other. Safe spaces are not about solving problems or fixing what's broken. They're about creating room for healing, for growth, for understanding. And the more we make room for that kind of space in our lives, the more we'll begin to see its ripple effect in the world around us. When we create safe spaces, we give people permission to heal. We give them permission to be who they truly are, without fear of being judged or rejected. And we give ourselves permission to do the same. So let's not wait for others to create those spaces for us. Let's be the ones to build them brick by brick, person by person, moment by moment. Because when we do, we unlock the potential for deeper connections, for profound healing, and for a world that is a little kinder, a little more compassionate, and a little more human. So as we move through this world, let's remember the immense power of safe spaces, not just as places we seek out, but as environments we intentionally create. Let's be mindful of the emotional energy we share, of the words we choose, and of the way we show up for one another. Let's recognize that true vulnerability doesn't just lighten our own hearts, but also deepens the connection we share with others. When we honor our own need for safety, when we take responsibility for creating spaces where others can be seen and heard, we begin to break down the walls of isolation that keep us apart. In a world that often asks us to be strong, to be perfect, to be something we're not, we must have the courage to create spaces where it's okay to not have it all figured out. We must be the ones who extend grace, understanding, and compassion not only to others, but also to ourselves. So I encourage you today to look around you. Where can you create a little more space for others to show up as they are? How can you be the kind of person who listens deeply, who holds space with empathy, and who allows others to be vulnerable without fear? Because in the end, it is these spaces, the ones we create together, that make us stronger, that heal us, and that allow us to rise up as our fullest, truest selves. Thank you.